Today, we are pleased to be joined by KU chemical engineers Lauren and Matt Cain of Elm Dirt as they share their fascinating journey of starting their business in 2020 and developing formulas for Elm Dirt's fertilizer and soil blends. Now, 4 years later, their effective natural and organic fertilizer options made right here in the metro with worm composting are used in all 50 states by gardeners, golf courses, farmers, and it's going to be soon tested at Wimbledon, which I'm sure we'll hear about. So please welcome Lauren and Matt Cain. Let me turn your mics on here.
We're on. All right.
Okay, cool.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited you all came out today to come listen to us talk. Matt and I are very passionate about what we do. So ask us any questions at the end. Hopefully we'll cover a lot of what you guys are wanting to know about what we do. We have to share, of course, our story and what really makes us passionate about what we do. And then we'll go into a lot of the science. As Eric mentioned, we are chemical engineers. We can't help but not touch on the science of what we do. But a lot of it is also due to our children up there. That's actually a lot of why I started the company, was that little lady in Matt's arms up there, Emma, and she is the E in Elm. So our Elm stands for Emma, Logan, and Mama.
And then beef, dirt for dad, I guess, or something like that, you know.
So we graduated from KU in 2010, and since then we've been doing a whole bunch of odd jobs along the way, and worked in a lot in manufacturing in the oil companies, and then transitioned to becoming entrepreneurs in 2015. And so it's been a journey along the way to get to where we are, and along the way we found kind of our passion. With Elm Dirt, we have been able to get all of this support from all different groups throughout the Kansas City area, especially even all the way to the USDA, who did award us a grant in 2023. Actually, we were one of 8 companies out of 350 that applied that got it first round for our sustainable American-made fertilizer. And so we'll go into what makes us special, what is really different about what we do, and our backgrounds that brought us to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission here is to rethink how we're growing to make healthier soil, healthier plants, and that make a difference in the world. So some of what you've heard about synthetic fertilizer, when you apply synthetic fertilizer, 50% of it is only used by the plants. The other 50% runs off into our waterways, into our atmosphere. It's a big source of climate change causing emissions. And so everything that we're producing is sustainably made, sustainably sourced, and really makes that difference. So a lot of our products will lock in nutrients into the soil, even the synthetic nutrients, keep it where it's meant to be, and help reduce the level of emissions. So we've been helping over 100,000 plant lovers. We've recycled over 200,000 recycled plastic bottles. So all of our plastic bottles are actually made from 100% post-consumer recycled plastic here in the United States. It's actually made in Ohio, soon to be made in Missouri too. And so we're really proud of all the efforts we've been able to do from not just our products, but all the way through our supply chain. You'll also hear us talk about all of our ingredients too. They are all sourced mainly from North America, couple sources that are a little farther away, but we try and keep it as close to home as possible. We've had over 20 tons of waste diverted from the landfill for our worm composting efforts. And then we have over 30 tons diverted nitrogen from our waterways, and that's just from the use of our products, locking in the nutrients, replacing synthetic fertilizer, and keeping it where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, we started when we were originally getting going back in 2021. We got a grant from Mark, which was to expand our original worm farm. And their whole initiative that we kind of fell under was diverting the food waste from the Kansas City area from the landfills. So we're like, well, we're going to have a whole bunch of worms here, you know, and they need food to eat. So we went to a whole bunch of local businesses and everything like that, and got everything from smoothie shop scraps to brewery grains to coffee grounds and all sorts of different sources. You know, and again, that's just going how we're trying to sit here and with all of our products, make the world a little bit of a better place also at the same time.
So we originally started January 2020, so great timing. This little lady in pink, she was a dedicated dirt eater. So she would grab fistfuls of dirt out of her backyard, and I was concerned about the weed killer, the fertilizer pellets that she was eating. She'd eat it out of our pots, and I could not stop her. Even at 6 months old, she was dedicated to it. And I was just like, I can't believe I'm worried about this in my own backyard. I need to make this safe environment for my children so that they can run around and not have to worry and play in the dirt like I grew up doing. And so I'd heard about worm composting from his family. So my husband, Matt, had a worm farmer in his family back in the 1980s. And so they raised worms and sold them online. And so we were like, okay, we want to do this on a personal level, but January 2020, I woke up and was like, I have to share this with more people. More people have to be feeling the same way I do. And so my original plan was to sell this in farmers markets in person in the Kansas City area. But then, of course, the pandemic had other ideas for us. So we have a background in online sales as well. Once we left the oil companies in 2015, we started our own online sales e-commerce project. Matt was very heavy into online advertising at that time. And so we really took all of our background to transition to online sales and to worm composting online. So we raise worms in our own dining room, in our basement. We've run through all sorts of different worm composting setups, and we'll share a little bit about composting worms and how they're different, and the uniqueness that they are. Some of the stories along the way too.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. When the beginning of the quarantine was happening, luckily just live 10 houses down from my parents, so we would sit there and have meals together. And one day we just had these big black bins in our dining room. We're sitting there eating dinner, and my mom was like, well, what are those things? Like, oh yeah, those are worm bins. We're like, you have worm bins? Like, what are worm bins? And she'd never heard of it before. We're like, yeah, we got a whole bunch of composting worms in there. Kind of explain the whole vision and everything like that. And she's like, they're in your dining room and it doesn't smell. We're like, yeah, that's how it should be. And so it's just kind of funny seeing how everything evolved from there. We started with these 3 black bins, which eventually ended up being more of these bins right here. And then all of a sudden our entire basement was full of them within a year. And we had all sorts of fun with these little guys. They would sit there, package up all of our little worms. We'd have to weigh them for specific amounts, and they put them in the jars, and we box them all up. So they're very instrumental in getting this thing off the ground and running. But then also we had to be really cognizant of all the bugs that we introduced, because I know some of you are familiar with worm composting, but these are living, breathing things. So you get a lot of other decomposer bugs and everything like that. And depending on your food source, you breed other bugs. So there are fruit flies, there are biting flies, and eventually we had to find something that kind of came to an equilibrium that didn't smell, didn't breed flies, so that we could actually use our basement as a basement also at the same time. Kind of funny.
So composting worms are a little bit different than just your normal earthworms that are in your backyard. So if you go in your backyard, you might see worms that are very long and very thick. They can almost look like snakes these days. Those are earthworms. And so they will burrow up to 10 feet down into the soil. They'll travel very large distances. Composting worms, there's about 7 to 10 different species of composting worms in the world. There's only a handful of them that are non-invasive to the United States, but they're much smaller. So you can come up here. We've got worms up here that you can come touch and see and look at. But composting worms are much smaller. They're only a couple inches long, and they're very skinny. They live in the top 6 inches of soil or in leaf litter or composting piles, really. They don't wander a whole bunch, and they are very content to just stay there as long as they've got the right conditions. So we have fed the worms a wide range, as Matt mentioned, from smoothie waste to our own home waste to now our manufacturing waste from the natural products that we're manufacturing. And one of the things that you'll see, a common misconception online, is that there's specific things that worms will eat and won't eat. In reality, they'll eat just about everything. The oils will coat their skin, and their breathing is actually through their skin. And so oils are about the only thing you don't want to introduce to a composting worm at all, because it will harm them. But there are certain things you don't want. So dairy and meat worms will eat, but they tend to smell in an outdoor bin. They may attract predators. So most people just don't want those in their pile. Citrus and onions can harm the worms if they're in large quantities, but they'll still eat them to a certain extent. Blueberries too will do the same. It's funny, they have a taste, and so blueberries tend to get left to the last. Even though we like them, the worms think they're gross. So we only introduce those in small quantities, a little at a time. And we're happy to talk through all the details, but composting worms also only live in bedding and then food. So when we help people get their own composting, we have small under-the-counter worm bins that we sell online that we help people get started with. And people are always amazed that you can start that with just some shredded paper, a little bit of water, and then food waste. That's it. You don't need soil. You don't need anything fancy. In our worm bins in our warehouse, we use coco coir, which is just shredded coconut husks. So we're not using any peat moss. We're not using any soil in there. But that's what the worms like. And then they turn it all into nice dark black worm castings that everybody likes.
Yeah, a lot of the bigger industrial worm farms will use peat moss as a bedding source. And if you're not familiar with peat moss, it's essentially just like the bottoms of bogs. So they literally have to go and dredge it all. And they say it's like a renewable source of material, but that takes like 50 million years to actually be renewable. So I don't know. No, we avoid that as much as possible. But coconut coir is just coconut husks, like broken down coconut husks, which are in abundance here. And so that we take great care to make sure that we're, again, making that positive impact on the environment with our products.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to touch on too is cocoon. So that's a worm egg. So there's a little cocoon up there. We've also got some up here if you want to take a look at one in person. But it takes 2 worms to make a cocoon. And then every cocoon has about 4 to 6 eggs in there. But worms don't have genders. There's no boy or girl worm. So they just find partners and make the little cocoons, but they can double in population every 3 to 4 months or so. So they, under the right conditions, can grow really rapidly.
And one of the things that when we were originally looking at this from like a business perspective was, hey, what is the market out there for these worms? And one of the first things that we noticed is that there was one really major supplier of composting worms in the United States. And they would say, hey, check out all these red wigglers. All the gardens want the red wigglers. That's what everyone kind of knows about. But there's actually 2 main species of red wigglers that if you haven't done your research, that you could get them mixed up very easily. You'll see here on these guys, our red wigglers, we have these yellow tails here. Well, these guys are actual red wigglers. They are, like Lauren said, all these worms have different personalities. These are your big lazy dogs that don't move, want you to put the food bowl right under their head so that they could sit there and eat it. They won't move or anything like that as long as they're nice and happy fed. The cousins to these guys, which look very, very similar, are called Indian blues, but get lumped into the red wiggler category also. They do not have these the yellow tails. They have like a little purple shimmer to them a little bit. Look very similar size also. But these guys are like high energy Labradors that just want to run around everywhere. They'll come for the food and everything like that, then they'll scatter. We've had multiple times where we'd have thunderstorms in our house and in our warehouse where these Indian blues at the time would sit there and escape. And we had no idea about this at the time. And they were like, man, this is, a big opportunity for us, because if we could get these nice and easy, docile red wigglers that are actually red wigglers, sell it to the people and actually have the right worms that we're introducing and advertising to, that could be a really big opportunity. And that was kind of the whole initial push for this whole entire business that we have.
So when we started online sales, we were originally selling just the worms and their worm poop, the worm castings. What we found out was the nation sells out of composting worms every year and their worm castings, and it's very hard for worm farms to keep up. There are multiple major worm farms in our nation. We've visited to a lot of them and talked to them and learned their techniques and the trials, because there's more than enough for all of us to be working on this project together. But we also knew that we'd never keep up. So to maximize the effectiveness of worm castings, we started looking into organic fertilizers and how we can make formulas that harness that beautiful power of worm castings, which rehabilitates soil. It introduces the gut microbiome from the worms into the soil, so you get really healthy microorganisms in there, as well as a bunch of stuff that's not normally in just traditional compost. And we wanted to harness that power, but also incorporate some other ideas to make a synthetic fertilizer replacement. And so that's kind of where the next transition took place. And so that was end of 2020, beginning of 2021, when we kind of started that journey.
We were, hold up one back. When we were selling these, we would sell them all nationwide, or at least the lower 48 states. And so in the summer, we'd have to sit here and figure out, okay, it's 110 degrees in Phoenix, right? And these have to go through UPS trucks. And it's like, okay, now we have these little, our packaging has evolved a lot since then. This was our first iteration, but still, you know, you got them in these little bags that have to sit there and go through 160 degrees, and it's very, very hard to do. And on the flip side of that, when it's in the winter and you're shipping them up to Maine and everything like that, it's super duper cold also. So we'd have to look at the regional weather and to see if we need to delay shipments and all these kinds of things that made it really hard, like logistically, to sit there and ship all these worms out and make sure that they're actually arrive safe, because it's just awful sending out worms places and then they don't end up alive. And again, that's where our kind of transition to the fertilizer side kind of was this next logical step, because, well, you know, the liquid doesn't really care how hot or cold it is anymore. And, you know, as far as like a mass appeal, people be much more interested in doing the liquid fertilizers as opposed to like the actual live worms, which, you know, it is kind of like taking care of another animal and everything like that in the household. You have to give attention, you have to give it love. It's not hard, but also at the same time, it is another thing to just kind of add on top of everyday life.
So in the development of these formulas for our fertilizer, well, we had to do a lot of research. We looked at a lot of different scientific articles. We talked to a lot of experts in different fields, a lot of plant experts, horticulturalists. We searched in all sorts of different places and talked with master gardeners, just to see what was out there, what people had tried before, what was working, what was on the market, and then where was leading science taking us. And so we then had to take all of that information and boil it down into what we thought the formulas would be, and then test it in our warehouse. And some of the things we've run across is, I mean, it's a living organism. We've got microbes in our products. Some people refrigerate those, but we knew, again, we wanted to make this simple for people to use. We didn't want something that was hard for people to store or use and incorporate into their lives. So we wanted to focus also on how the earth naturally rehabilitates. So when you come up here and you look at all of our ingredients, we've really taken care to look at not only how they're sustainably sourced, but also how it rehabilitates the earth. So we're looking at the volcanoes, we're looking at the oceans, we're looking at the wildfires and the worms and every piece of that on how it is rehabilitating the earth. Because like after a volcano erupts, after a couple of years, that's the most fertile soil you can have, right? And same with wildfires and places that get covered in oceans. I mean, Kansas and Missouri used to be oceans at one point in time, and so that's led to a lot of our fertile soil. So we were taking all of that information and boiling it down into the science behind why it was making fertile soil.
And we were, If you think about jungles, they don't get fertilized. People aren't sitting there spreading fertilizer on them at all, right? It all does it in its natural ecosystem. Whereas we in our home gardens, we have to sit there and have fertilizer to make sure that our soil has the actual nutrients to actually produce flowers and the plants and all those kinds of things. So it's like, okay, and that's where a lot of these older techniques like permaculture, Korean natural farming all kind of come in. They looked at what was done naturally and apply that to your home gardens. And so that's kind of what we did is like, okay, how can we take this whole concept and essentially put it in a bottle so people don't have to be aware of what is happening. You just put it on your plants and it just works really well. That sits there and rehabs your soil at the same time of making your plants grow really well.
So when we developed our plant juice and bloom juice, those were original formulas, and that's where we kind of started. We had so many different changes where we grew as a company. So we even hand bottled, hand labeled our products in our warehouse. We also had to work on breeding our own bacteria and fungi because what we were doing wasn't on the market. It was not something we could just go to someone else and buy. It was something that we were developing and testing in-house, sending to third-party labs to make sure that what we were doing was correct, and that we were making what we were intending to make. And then testing in farms, in people's backyards, in testing facilities to make sure that it was treating the plants the right way. And so what we ultimately came up with in the plant and bloom juice is combining microbes with micronutrients, and what we call beneficial non-plant food ingredients. And we'll go into more details about what those are, but the important thing is all four of those combined is not something that's out there right now. It's a complete fertilizer in a sense that it's got everything plants could use that's not in a synthetic fertilizer today.
How most fertilizer and gardening products are kind of developed these days is it goes from like agriculture on down to the home gardeners. Well, we kind of flip that on its head rather than going in a very small, sterile, research focused, to see how corn can germinate or something along those lines. We kind of started with our products, tested them ourselves, got it out to the market, then got the feedback from everyone that we were sending it to. And, we were fortunate enough, people were like, hey, this stuff is really good. You should look at X, Y, and Z. And so that's where Lauren was talking about these plant experts. We got hooked up with a whole bunch of them from a bunch of different various industries. They're like, hey, if you add this will help these issues. And we've essentially kind of built our whole product line off of our actual customers that use our products. So we've kind of flipped that whole thing on its head, which has helped us be really, really successful with how our product is actually functioning in the home gardeners, which has been really fun to sit there and tinker with.
So to break it down even further, so when we are talking about what we feed ourselves, and Matt actually came up with this analogy, is we have a lot of things that we are focused on from our own personal body perspective. But if we just focus on what we need for survival, if you feed yourself fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, you would live. You wouldn't be healthy per se, but you would live. But then you add in other things like calcium, iron, magnesium, you start adding another layer. But then the things we're starting to talk about these days, like the probiotics that people are taking, we're learning about the gut microbiome and how that is affecting our cravings, our moods, and a lot of things about our bodies. And there's even more that happen with plants that we're just now starting to learn about. And then there's all sorts of other things we do for our bodies. Working out, we're adding additives, we're taking vitamins that help with everything that our body does. Well, that's true also of plants. But one of the biggest focus has always been NPK, the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And so that's just like the fats, protein, and carbohydrates for our bodies, but for plants. And so we like to say the plants are on life support at that point. You're just keeping them alive, you're keeping them thriving. You can keep adding more and you might keep them thriving, but if you add too much, you might burn their roots, hurt the plants themselves if you add too much.
You have to have the fungicides, insecticides, and all these things to keep all the bugs and predators off of your plants just because the plants can actually defend themselves. Their immune system for the plants is actually just shut down because you're feeding them, McDonald's Big Macs all the time. You'll survive, but you won't actually thrive.
And so plants actually do need calcium, iron, magnesium, just like our bodies. And in a lot of ways, it's very similar. To have calcium absorption in plants, you still need that magnesium to help with that transport into the plants themselves. If you add too much calcium, you'll lock out other nutrients, and same with your body. A lot of similarities there that most people don't really think about. And in most cases, we're not adding these micronutrients unless it's a special case like tomato plants. Everybody hears you need to add more calcium for tomato plants. But then there's a point where it's too much, and you'll see other deficiencies in your tomato plants because you've added too much calcium. But then there's a whole nother world beyond that. The microbes are really this emerging science that's coming out about it. And some of the microbes even go into plant roots. They help transport nutrients into plant roots. They travel widely across fungal networks that cross many acres. And so they'll transport water and nutrients, but they'll also transport information. And so some really cool things in farms is that if a plant has a very supportive fungal network across a whole field, if one plant gets attacked by, say, Japanese beetles, it can alert plants even across acreage that there's Japanese beetles, and they can induce their immune system and get more protected against them. So when the Japanese beetles come, they might lose one plant in the whole acre versus maybe an entire acreage.
There's been a lot more science articles that have come across our desk about plants emitting like ultrasonic sounds. And so what'll happen is, these plants will sit there and emit these sounds that we can't hear, but all the insects can. And just like us, they have different modes of talking like we do. We can act really scared and sound scared, or we can sound really, really confident. And so that's exactly what the microbes in our products will do. Will just really, in a healthy soil environment, will do. It'll sit there and bolster up the plants and make them act nice and tough. So all the bugs will sit there and go over to your neighbor's yard when their plants are sitting there screaming because you're just seeing them and feeding them NPK nutrients. Really interesting stuff.
So we like to call the 4 pillars of plant health, that's the complete fertilizer that we were talking about. And so these macronutrients, the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, they're what helps plants grow. That's why we've been focused on it for so long. And it helps increase plant yields. It helps keep everything green. So there's a really big benefit to focusing on that. That's what our traditional fertilizer has been about. And then we have micronutrients, and those can be the difference between a store-bought tomato and the ones that are homegrown, is the micronutrients, because in a store-bought tomato, it's grown in a field that's been used for tomatoes over and over again and only supplied NPK and not really had this focus on micronutrients. And in a home garden, you've maybe grown a few tomato plants, you've rotated where they were, it's getting the micronutrients it needs, even if you're not adding them from your soil because it hasn't been depleted yet. And some people do add some micronutrients from supplemental fertilizers. Like I mentioned, the tomatoes especially, calcium is one of those really hot ones that people always talk about. You need more calcium for tomato plants. And then fungi and bacteria is something that we talk about it on a compost level. It's why compost is super important for increasing the soil health. But there's so much more to it. I mentioned earlier, the gut biome from worms has a different set than traditional compost. And there's thousands and thousands of different species of microbes. And some of them have the ability to help plants with drought tolerance. Some of them have help with disease. Some of them help with plant growth. So many different wide functions out there. And it's not just from the activity of the microbes themselves, but it's from the hormones they produce. It's from the things they interact with. So there's a lot of different things that they're doing. And then the beneficial non-plant food ingredients that I mentioned, these are still natural ingredients. These are silica, yuccas, humic acids. So you'll get humic acid and humus from compost. So that may be where you're familiar with it on a natural level. But it's stuff that helps with the delivery of the nutrients. It helps strengthen the plant walls. It helps strengthen cell walls even. And so it may not be direct food for the plants, but it's still helping the plants in some way.
And really, when you combine all four of these, that's where like the real magic starts to happen. Because the plants need the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to sit there and live, right? That's our fats, proteins, and carbs. If you get the micronutrients in there, like Lauren said, you get these nice homegrown tomatoes. And so the plants can sit there and use those ingredients really readily. But once you add the microbes and the non-plant food ingredients and give them the food sources that they need to actually function like on a biological standpoint, that's where all the really cool like root gut bacteria and fungi and functions start to happen. So you really need all four of these together to get a really, really healthy ecosystem, which is exactly what happens naturally in rainforests and jungles, but is sorely missing in our home gardens and agricultural land.
So some of the benefits of whole plant health, and we see this a lot when we talk with especially farmers who have everything invested into their crops, right? Is in that increased drought tolerance. I mean, we hear about it a lot, especially this time of year as the temperatures are warmer, and we have a lot of drought problems here in Kansas and Missouri. But we apply our lawn care to our lawn. And what we see is we need less water because it's not a salt-based fertilizer. It doesn't require more water to activate those salts and to keep those salts rinsed off. And then because we're developing that fungal network in the soil, it helps lock in the moisture better. And so like last August, during the heat of the summer when we're in a drought, we're over here, our neighbors are watering at least 2 to 3 times a week, and we're still have our nice green lawn, and we've maybe watered once a month. And it's been pretty amazing to see just that difference on a personal level, but we hear it from our farmers a lot more because they don't have that in-ground sprinkler system or the ability to take a hose out there and just go water their fields whenever they need it. And they're very dependent on rainfall and keeping it locked in where it needs to be.
And this is just one of the benefits of some of the microbes in our products. There's some biological companies out there that'll specifically focus on like nitrogen fixation, which is literally taking nitrogen from the air and then putting into the soil. It's like, well, that's a really cool concept, right? There's a lot of big companies out there on the West Coast that are sitting there and developing this stuff in research labs and everything. It's like, well, these things are all naturally occurring in our soil right now. That's why, if you ever heard of soybeans are nitrogen fixing, that's exactly what happens, is they have a whole bunch of bacteria on their roots on the soybeans, and they'll literally just draw out all of the nitrogen from the air, put it back into the soil. So we can take those same microbes that are already naturally occurring, put them in our product, and that function will happen. We have this drought tolerance. We have bacteria and fungi for the immune suppression. We have for pest resistance, for growth hormones, like all these different things. Again, we very much look at the everything holistically. We want to have as many species of microbes in here that are beneficial to the plants so that they can have the most benefit overall rather than one specific function here, there, and everything else.
So we kind of touched on nitrogen fixation. And so that's a very important concept when we're talking about synthetic fertilizer, especially because synthetic fertilizer focuses a lot on nitrogen and adding it to our soil and into our plants. But we have a lot of nitrogen in our air. And there's a lot of plants, especially that we know of that pull nitrogen from the air. And what we're learning is those microbes in the soil are actually really super important to do that. And so the nitrogen cycle is what it's called. It's kind of similar to our carbon cycle. And there's microbes that also work in the carbon cycle and pull carbon from the air and store it into the ground. But nitrogen is really super complicated. There's a lot that goes into it. And so right here in the middle is nutrients on land. And so that nutrients on land, I mentioned at the beginning that 50% of our synthetic fertilizer we're using actually runs off. So it's only 50% is getting used by our crops, by our lawns, by our gardens. The other 50% ends up most of the time in our waterways and then eventually into our air. In the waterways, that's where we're seeing the Mississippi dead zone. That's where we're seeing the red tide. We see it in Western Kansas in the high nitrates in our waterways, in our drinking water. And so it's a huge problem that is becoming more and more unmanageable.
And that's mainly because the NPK nutrients that a lot of the farmers and fertilizers use are all salt-based, right? So what does salt do in water? It dissolves. So when you sit there and water your plants or the rain falls on the farmland for their crops, well, all those nitrogen sources just get swept away. So like Lauren said, 50% of it is just goes straight into our water and causes a whole bunch of issues for us.
And so when we look at the soil and the roots itself, there's so many important things that are happening with nitrogen. And like the nitrogen fixing bacteria is pulling it from the air and supplying it to the plants. It's also some nitrogen fixing bacteria produce ammonium, and that's also going into the plants and creating the nitrates and everything on a natural level. So they're kind of like little mini synthetic fertilizer plants in themselves, except on an organic level in your soil. And so encouraging this healthy soil health is really important to reducing our need for synthetic fertilizer. And that's one of the things we've been really focused on is encouraging this, because every time we put down synthetic fertilizer, we're kind of killing off a lot of these bacteria and fungi that are really performing important functions. Now, that's not to say that they don't have their place. We work with a lot of farmers that use our products in conjunction with synthetic fertilizer to lock it in where it needs to be, to increase their soil health and still be able to get the benefits of synthetic fertilizer. So there's definitely a place for every piece of it. But the really cool part is we do have a synthetic fertilizer replacement that is sustainable and can be made on a large scale.
And this also happens on the carbon cycle as well. So we have bacteria in here that will sequester the carbon, CO2 from the atmosphere, put it into the soil for carbon sources for the plants. So we're actively combating the global warming side just by providing the soil back what it naturally has, which is, again, it's a really elegant solution to a lot of issues that we're facing right now.
So some of the ways we've seen our products used is we have a Kansas championship rose grower, and he's been really focused on everything he can do to grow roses. And he's been growing roses for over 40 years, and he enters at least 2 to 4 championships every year. And he's got over 70 rose bushes that he takes care of on his own land. And in, what was that, 2022, I think was the first time he approached me. Because Lauren, this was May 2022, because Lauren, I just had weed killer overspray. I went out to my roses and they're starting to get curled leaves. They're starting to look like they're dying off. I think one of my neighbors or the development next door sprayed something that drifted over my rose bushes. He's like, I had this happen back in the 1990s and I lost over half my rose bushes. I couldn't enter any championships. I was just focused solely on keeping my rose bushes alive. And I like, okay, let's work on everything we can do to help strengthen the roots, strengthen your plants, and let's help your plants rebound from this. And so we developed a specific program for him to rehabilitate his rose bushes. And just 6 weeks later, he was like, I only lost 2 rose bushes. I was able to keep most of my rose bushes and my roses are looking great. And so by August of that year, he was thrilled because he was able to enter the Missouri Rose Championship, and he took home over 70 different ribbons, including 9 out of 13 Best in Show. And so he actually texted me earlier this week and was like, Lauren, I did it again and I owe it all to Elm Dirt. I went and entered the Kansas Rose Championship and I won that one too. And so he's been really a big supporter and really notices a difference in the root system, especially, and making hardier rose bushes that can overcome like weed killer overspray.
And this is a guy that's been growing roses for 40 years, right? So he knows the ins and outs of these plants a whole bunch. but there's still this big knowledge gap in the actual soil health side of things. And we've been talking to a whole bunch of master gardeners at K-State as well. And we're like, well, we kind of do this for all the soil, those 4 pillars of plant health. And like, man, well, we really don't do a whole bunch of that. And, they're sitting there testing our products also. And they had, their onions were bigger than they've ever seen before. They're like, everyone's just like, well, what did you do to these things? It's like, well, just Elm Dirt stuff. And it's just like, hey, if you focus on the soil, like it actually build it up to how it should be, it's like amazing things can happen. Again, eliminate all the need for all the weed overspray and help combat all those issues.
And we've been working with a lot more farmers these days. So the USDA grants that we received in 2023 was to expand into farms and helping farmers have a more sustainable, regenerative, American-made fertilizer. And so we've talked with a lot of regenerative farmers these days, and they're very focused on their soil health. They know a lot of the science, what we're talking about. They've been to a lot of classes. They've tried a lot of things. And one of the things they keep saying is, oh, I've tried, say, add silica to my plants, and it works really well. But on a large scale, it's not feasible. I can't add one product at a time, or there's something blocking me from using this one specific thing. And I would wish I could add more microbes by using like the Johnson & Sue bioreactors, but it's not always working 100% of the time, and I just can't rely on it for my farm. And so we've been using our products on a farm level. We have farm-specific products, and this is just one of our Central Missouri farmers who is a regenerative farmer, and his farm is incredible. He has sheep and cows that free range on his, well, it's a mixed grain field, and so he plants several times a year and grazes them across the different fields, and he was able to do strips. And so these strips are actually just 15 feet apart. They're on the same field. They've been treated the same way, except for one untreated strip and then one sprayed with our products. And the incredible thing is this is taken the same time. These pictures were, and those cows preferentially were eating off the Elm Dirt side that was sprayed. And it's just like the store-bought tomatoes. Like they know that that tastes better. And they know that it's more nutrient dense. And so that's one of the things about in regenerative agriculture is it creates more nutrient dense crops. And so this is what the cows and the sheep know. And we are just learning that as our universities are studying that. Washington University in 2022 came out with a study that showed regenerative agriculture grows more nutrient dense crops, and it's becoming a more and more of a hot topic. You see a lot of the large corporations starting to focus on where their crops are being grown so they can say that they're getting the more nutrient dense crops. The other incredible thing is not only was the cows and sheep preferentially grazing on this side, it grew 2 to 4 inches taller on that side. And then after they grazed it 2 weeks later, it regrew twice as fast. So he was able to recover more food for his cattle and not have to supplement in any way. So this is the evolution of our warehouse over the years. So this is when we first started in our warehouse in 2021 was when we first got our warehouse. And it's grown up over the years as we've transitioned from worm farm over to fertilizer manufacturing. And a lot of that is due to the USDA grants and to the reception of our products in the home gardener market and the farm market, and really all across the United States. So we sell in all 50 states, and we're starting to get recognition from a lot of big organizations. As we mentioned in the beginning, Wimbledon is reaching out to test our products on their courts. They have a big focus on soil health and incorporating that into their program. We've talked with a lot of big sports fields because they're starting to transition away from synthetic fertilizer because of the health effects on players. There's a lot of movement coming for moving away from synthetic fertilizer and into a microbe-based fertilizer. And it is stepwise. We work with a lot of farmers that incorporate it into their synthetic fertilizer routine. So it's not an all or nothing, but it's the direction the world is moving in.
Yep.
So we have a lot coming. We just launched our first pesticide product this year, our Elm Dirt Shield. It is an all-natural pesticide that is not harmful for pollinators. It is a kaolin and chitosan-based pesticide, and it has been shown to be effective against Japanese beetles. So that's really important for us that have rose bushes or things that get attacked by Japanese beetles this time of year. It's like a spray on diatomaceous earth is kind of how we explain it. It leaves that coating on there. We also have some physical products coming in the home gardening space. And I mean, obviously Wimbledon is not in the United States, so we have a lot of stuff that's coming internationally as well, and just keeping up with all the people who get really excited about our products. Well, we have a discount code for everyone that's here today, online or in person. We also have samples for everyone here today too. So feel free to come up, talk to us, touch the worms, come see all the different things we've brought for display. And thank you guys so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you guys. Any questions?
I'll come by with the microphone. We're live streaming today to a global audience, so we want to get the audio of your question on the live stream. So just raise your hand. I'll come by. Yep. Well, let me start here. I'll come back.
Oh, so the worm castings, they're dried. Does the bacteria live in the dryness of it? And does it reconstitute when it gets wet?
Yeah, it's interesting. Worm castings, while they do feel dry, they actually do have a moisture level that's in them. I think there's still like 30 to 40% moisture in there, even though it feels so dry. So that's what's helping keep the microbes alive. And when you add more, they become more active.
Yeah, you want to keep them in a mildly temperature controlled room, because if you leave them outside, they'll literally bake. And then, just like when we have a fever, that's what happens to us and how we cook the bacteria out. If it gets above 110, then a lot of these guys will end up dying off. Live recommendations.
This is the 4x14 veggie garden that I have.
Uh-huh.
What would you recommend for that?
So our plant juice specifically is made for the leafy green products. So it's going to be a lot more nitrogen heavy based for all your leafy green things. So I would definitely put that on there. Again, it'll get all those good bacteria and fungi in there. We have over 250 different species that help really start rehabbing your soil and really unlock like the actual plant health.
What about for soil material?
It does all that at the same time. All right, that's kind of the beauty of all of our stuff. We just made it in one nice and easy bottle, so you don't have to think about it. You just put it on and it works. We do all the sciencey things and everything like that. You just get to enjoy your plants growing bigger and better than ever. So you could do a soil drench, it's just fine. So this is all concentrated, so you dilute it like 2 gallons or 2 ounces per gallon. You could do a little soil drench. If you're planting things, like if you do it on the roots, like when you have like seedlings and everything like that, that works really, really well to really inoculate the roots.
We even have a hose and sprayer where you can just attach it to the bottle and attach it to your hose and just spray, and it will fit.
So yeah, the timing. So if you do it like right when you plant, we've seen the best results there, but literally any time. We've had people that have had like citrus trees that hadn't bloomed for 10 years and then put our bloom juice on, and all of a sudden lemons were coming off of it, like out of all over the place. Uh-huh. Yeah, that'll work. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Hang on a second.
Matt, while he's doing that, you might talk about the cost for the farmers.
Yeah, so it's great and all that we have this cool fertilizer that will sit there and improve all your health and everything like that, the soil health and everything. But if there's also, from a farmer's perspective, they are a business. So they have to have an economic case to actually make the change. And a lot of this stuff is literally underground, and it's going to take a lot of times for your soil to actually get rehabilitated. But what's really nice is, I've got an echo going here, is that we have like an immediate first year return on investment for our farmers also. So they can see the actual reduction in nitrogen and then the actual soil improvement in crop yields as well.
All right, now it's working.
There we go.
You had yucca, and one of the things I was just curious how you use that. And then do you have products that have similar organisms to the Johnson Sioux bioreactor?
Yeah, so yucca is a biosurfactant. So that's a really fancy term, but it kind of creates this kind of gel that helps hold everything together. We use very little yucca, especially in our bloom juice, to help lock it in and keep it where it's supposed to be. And then the yucca also has some very important nutrient transport properties as well. So it's kind of a really cool plant. I mean, we have yucca in our own yard and we hate it as a plant, but it's really got some fantastic abilities in as a biosurfactant. And then you mentioned the Johnson Sioux. We do have similar microbes to the Johnson Sioux bioreactor. And the Johnson Sioux bioreactors are fantastic. If you haven't heard of them, they're a fast composting. It still takes a year for farms to create their own bioactive extracts for their farms. And so we've had several farmers that have tried Johnson Sioux before, and they love the results. They got huge increases one year. The unfortunate thing is, because it's typically an outside bioreactor, it's subject to environmental stresses. And so it doesn't always perform the same every year. Because I don't know, maybe it's -13 one year and it kills off a lot of the microbes, or the next year it's super droughty and very hot and some of the microbes die off in that form. And so what we're doing with our microbes is kind of the same microbe structure. We get a lot of the same microbes that they do, but we make it consistently because we make it indoors in a manufacturing facility.
Yes.
You've got so much figured out, obviously. And there would be no way to address this, because you are a business, to separate the science from the business. But if I were to just ask, like on a specific science thing, like what are you trying to figure out currently, or maybe into the future?
So we are always looking at what scientists are currently studying. We're actually a lot of times talking with the people who created some of these ideas. We've been introduced to Johnson and Sioux. We've been introduced to several of the leading scientists, and there's always a lot more that we don't know. And so we've done a lot to figure out something that works today. But there's a lot more that's being developed and being researched. And so there's always room for more. There's always room for more of the science and more incorporation of what they're learning on a day-to-day basis.
We've had a lot of anecdotal evidence from all of our customers and everything like that. And then this year's big focus has been like, okay, let's put quantitative numbers to all those kinds of things, especially on the farmer side. We had, again, the cows grazing in the fields, it's all great and all, but hey, how much does our stuff grow and actually produce extra? And then not only like it's physically, but what is internally? Does it have a higher sugar content, a higher protein content? All these kinds of things that we're looking at. And then also with the nitrogen fixation and the carbon sequestering, it's like we see these science articles come out. It's like, hey, these specific microbes will sit there and sequester X amount of carbon from the air. It's like, great, we have those microbes in our products. So we need to see if we can do some sort of study or test with the university to see how much our product specifically can actually sequester, so that we can be like, have actual tangible evidence and say, hey, these are the things that our products can do. Here's all of our anecdotal stuff, and here's all of our scientific studies. So science is kind of lagging on all of our results. No, but that's kind of what we're trying to tie up from a scientific point of view right now.
Some of the other things we also look at is like weed killers. We always get asked, do you have a weed killer, a natural weed killer? Well, it's very hard to have a very specific killer of plants because that's what a weed killer is, right? And on a farm level, they are running out of ideas for chemical weed killers because every time they introduce a weed killer, the plants become more and more less susceptible to that weed killer. And so that's one of the things we're kind of working and helping understand too, because soil health does have a key in how many weeds grow. So like clover grows where there's a nitrogen deficiency. Dandelions also grow in specific soil conditions. And so if we're creating a healthy soil, there are actually less weeds that grow and less need for weed killer. But how do we get it to the point where it's feasible for lawns and for farms to not need weed killer anymore? And so that's one of the things we're looking at. And then things come across our desk all the time, like solar fields have a soil health issue in the chemicals that are leaching off into there. Well, microbes play a part in helping rehabilitate soil and getting rid of heavy metal toxicity and other chemical toxicities to soil. And so there's a lot of things that are out there still that are big scientific tasks that we're always trying to stay up on.
Yeah, just like our gut health, right? Where it's like, okay, it does all these things for your immune system and for your like mental capacities and, you know, possible like mental diseases later on in life. Well, that's all that science is coming out with the gut or the root bacteria biome as well.
All right, we have a question from an online viewer, then I'll get over to you. Have you been contacted by or have you worked with the Land Institute out in Salina?
We have briefly kind of touched on the Land Institute. I think we've been introduced to a couple people there, but we haven't done anything major with them, no.
I assume that you can overdo it as well, right? So how do you come up with your coverage sort of dosage, your application dosage, and what is too much of a good thing?
Well, this is actually kind of funny. Yeah, because normal like NPK synthetic fertilizers are salts. If you put on too much, you'll end up burning the plants and killing them all. When we were really early in this whole process and testing our products, we sat there and we had this little pepper plant that was, we kind of made it sad on purpose to see our effectiveness on it. And we kind of did all these tests and everything. At the end of it, it's like, okay, I'm just literally going to dump a half a bottle of this stuff on top of it and see what the heck happens. And then literally 2 days later, there are 3 brand new leaves that popped up and everything. And that was literally about a half of the whole container, like volume of the soil that we put in with our product. Because our products aren't salt-based, they're all whole food ingredients, you know, like, I guess we didn't really touch on this. So there's like alfalfa and kelp and the guanos and azomite. All those kinds of things are naturally occurring that don't actually hurt the plants. So we really don't have we haven't really found an upper limit. We haven't sat there and just only drenched our plants in it before, but there's really like I said, we haven't really seen that upper limit at all.
I'll also add to that we see different issues. So because this is a water-based formula instead of a salt-based formula, people go to add it to, say, succulents that don't need a bunch of water. So you kind of have to pay attention to what your plants actually need on a water level. If your plant has been starved for water for a long time and then get a dose of food, no matter what, they're going to get shocked. And then succulents don't need a whole bunch in one time. They're not going to need a gallon of water at one time. And so feeding what your plants need is really kind of the biggest key.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still thinking about the lazy worms. I had no idea that
Yep.
existed. So,
Lots of personalities.
Yeah.
that's interesting. So we're a little past the bottom of the hour. So we want to be sure to leave time. If you have further questions, I think Lauren and Matt are going to stick around for a while and talk about their products, get to play with the worm. So thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Matt, for such a wonderful presentation.
Sample for everybody.
We got samples for everyone. And thank you all for attending today's second Saturday presentation. And I hope to see you back here soon. Well, first of all, stick around for a little while, but I hope to see you back here soon for another event. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for listening, guys.